Hey, I'm Mick West of MetaBunk.org. Professor Hulsey's report on the collapse of Building 7, World Trade Center 7, came out a few days ago. And I've been looking at it. I've read the report. I've looked at Professor Hulsey's presentation, and I've looked at all the videos that architects and engineers for 911Truth have shared on their channel of the various simulations. And I've got a few questions that I'm going to run through very quickly, and then I'm going to go into them in more detail. So, my first question is, why does figure 4.16 not show dynamic analysis? Now, figure 4.16 is this. It is supposedly a simulation of what NIST proposed with some columns being removed, and it's supposed to show a dynamic analysis of that situation. It doesn't appear to do that, though. Instead, all it appears to do is show the top portion of the building simply rotating around a pivot point through the bottom point of the building with no distortion whatsoever. My second question is, what is the justification for static linear analysis in figure 4.14? 4.14 and similarly 4.15 are this diagram here. Now you see here it says visualization of linear static analysis, and yet we use something that's obviously far beyond the bounds of linear static analysis. In particular, we have these columns that have been stretched out here, which isn't something that is really what you would do in linear static analysis. My next question is, what is the animation in figure 4.20 derived from? 4.20A and B show essentially the showpiece of this thing. You see is what's shown on the cover here, this neat bowing in of the penthouse. But is it actually a dynamic analysis? Because it doesn't appear to be one, because everything kind of moves as if it's almost animated by hand. You see the penthouse falls in very neatly there, and everything just falls away with no real distortion. Doesn't really look like it's a proper analysis. My next question is, why do you continue to confuse NIST's ANSYS model with their LS-DYNA model? This is something that is in the report on pages 29 and 30. You say that the progressive collapse model was separated into two parts. You show it here and you show a line in the model. Problem is, this is the LS-DYNA model. This diagram refers to the ANSYS model, the 16th floor model. This is the global model. The 16th floor model is a completely different model. So I don't understand why you keep saying this wrong. If you even look at the diagram on your previous page, it says here ANSYS. It says World Trade Center 7 16-story model. This is what they did in the 16-story model. This is not the 16-story model. This is not the ANSYS model. This is the LS-DYNA model. Why did you get them confused? My next question is, why focus on Gerda A2001 when NIST did not use that in their global collapse? NIST actually used the fire damage model from their simulation, which did not include the push-off of Gerda A2001, which is what you spend quite a lot of the report focusing on. So this model here, this LS-DYNA model, doesn't actually use the thing you spend most of the report in debunking. So let's go back into this in a bit more detail here. So let's go back to the first question. Why does figure 4.16 not show dynamic analysis? What is dynamic analysis, and how does it differ from static analysis? Well, in static analysis, you're essentially simulating a building that's not moving, it's not collapsing, and it's not swaying around that much. It just has loads applied to it, and then you figure out how much those loads cause deflection of the building, and then you see, will the structure support that amount of deflection. So you're checking to see basically that the building won't collapse. So in static analysis, things don't move. They might deflect and deform a bit, but generally they're not going to move. Now, there's also the difference between linear and nonlinear. Linear analysis is where the response of connections is essentially just a simple linear response. It's like a spring. If you put in so much force, you get so much deflection. If you deflect it so much, that means that so much force is being applied. It's this simple linear response. Nonlinear means that it changes if it deflects more than a certain amount. That changes. Like if you pull a string out long enough, eventually it's going to stretch out and it's not going to be springy anymore. And so it's gone beyond its linear response and it's now in a nonlinear response. when a building is subjected to extreme loads, like a sudden removal of a column, you really want to use nonlinear because the connections are going to be deformed so much that their response isn't going to be linear anymore. But unfortunately, it seems that Professor Hulsey uses just linear. But what we're talking about here is a dynamic model. Now, dynamic, things move. Here we are, things moving. In fact, moving quite a lot. The problem is, in a proper dynamic simulation, you shouldn't just have the top half of the building rotating like this. You wouldn't just have this rotating. The outside of the building is structural columns. So these structural columns should actually be impacting the bottom structural columns. So if this was an actual dynamic analysis, you would expect to see a lot of bending down here. You don't see anything. In fact, what you see, it's kind of curious, is that he's removed an entire floor worth of columns here. So we've got this bottom part, then we've got a gap, then we have the top part. And if you play the animation, what happens is the top part just simply rotates and passes through the bottom part. This very clearly is not a dynamic simulation of the any situation. It's supposed to be trying to simulate what NIST said happened. Now let's compare it to an actual dynamic simulation, the NIST simulation. Let me just find that. Here's the actual simulation that NIST did. I overlaid 3 different simulations and I kind of flipped it so you can see what's going on. But it's a dynamic simulation. Things are moving. Floors are falling, columns are bending, things are actually moving quite a lot. In a dynamic simulation, you would expect a lot of things to happen. So here we see the top fall in here, and we see the interior collapsing, and we see a lot of deformation of the columns on the interior of the building. Because the interior is collapsing, it's starting to buckle over here, and this is why eventually the entire interior collapses and the outside collapses. You also see this deformation here, which you don't see in reality. A lot of people point to that as being a problem. But really that's just kind of indicative of the complex nature, the chaotic nature essentially of simulations like this. Once you've gone past the initial points, the actual outcome can vary quite a lot. Hulsey talked about this in his talk, actually. Someone asked him why there wasn't a kink in the top of the building, and he explained that he tried and tried and tried to get this kink in his model, but he could never actually do it. So he didn't really understand why there wasn't that kink. But anyway, this is what a dynamic simulation should actually look like. This is not. This is just one box rotating. It's not simulating anything. It's just the top box rotating. And he does this again in figure 4.20. This is figure 4.20, which is basically the same type of thing. I think it's just a different. This is where we removed all the columns simultaneously, and he says this made the building tip over to one side, which not only doesn't really make sense, because why would the building's momentum move sideways when it's all going down? The center of gravity isn't going to pop out to the side. But you've got the same thing again. You've got this row of columns removed. An entire floor of columns has been removed. Bottom isn't moving at all, and the top just simply rotates through the top. Seems like there might be a little distortion here, but it's kind of hard to tell. But basically, this is not a dynamic simulation. Next question. What is the justification for static linear analysis in figure 4.14? This is figure 4.14. It says visualization of linear static analysis from the southeast, showing the building tipping to the southeast after the hypothetical failure of columns 76 to 81. This is, I think, 4 columns over here. Now, this says linear static analysis. Now, I've already discussed why linear analysis really isn't appropriate. You want a nonlinear response, especially if you're doing things like stretching out columns, which we wouldn't really do. But it's a static analysis. And static analysis you use when things don't really move very much. Things kind of settle, you see things settling, but when a building is starting to tip over, then the momentum of the building itself will come into play. The momentum of the movement of the columns impacting other columns will come into play. This is, when you do static analysis, it's like this really, really gradual thing. You kind of let it settle a bit, and then you would run the simulation again. You let it settle a little bit more, then you run the simulation again. You ignore time, and you ignore momentum, and you ignore like collisions and the momentum of those collisions between objects. So in a situation like this, with the building tipping over to the side, I don't think that static analysis is really a very appropriate thing. And linear static analysis really isn't at all, because you're going to expect all kinds of deformation here, which is going to completely change the linear response. Big thing here, obviously, is these columns here appear to have been stretched out to about 3 times their natural length, which of course is impossible. And it can suggest that it's just using a kind of a linear spring for the columns in the back, which is a bit inappropriate, I think, and wrong, I think, in many, just basically wrong. This actually carries on to figure 4.15, which is the same type of thing. It's even more dramatic here. You can see these columns stretching out here, and then there's this kind of weird deformation here. And you see a bit of the floors being squished down at the front, which is what you'd expect. But this is something that you do not see in the supposed dynamic analysis. In the dynamic analysis, you don't see these floors being crushed, which you should, because so that's obviously not a dynamic analysis. If you can show it in the static analysis, then you certainly should be able to show it in the dynamic analysis. Again, here it is. There's no real crushing going on. It's more apparent in the other animation. This just kind of slides off. It's kind of a bizarre thing. It wouldn't happen. It's just ridiculous. I think what's happening here, though, is he's kind of taking what he thinks are the results of the static analysis, which is completely inappropriate and is pushed far too far beyond its limits. And he said, oh, it's tilted over like this in the static analysis. Let's do a dynamic analysis, like a kind of a pretend dynamic analysis. And so he's taken this static analysis and then he's just made the building just kind of rotate around a point to match this angle, which is complete nonsense. This is obviously not a dynamic analysis. All right, next point. Why focus on Girder A2001 collapse when NIST did not use that in their global collapse analysis? Now, there's a lot of focus on this one connection, Girder A2001 to column 79, and NIST suggested that the expansion of beams next to it pushed it off its seat, and that was a collapse initiation event. It was suggested a probable collapse initiation event. But NIST didn't actually use that in their dynamic analysis. That was one result of their their ANSYS analysis, which is a kind of a more detailed local model. But if you look at the actual results of their LS-DYNA model, this is the global model, I actually mark column 79 on this, and we can see what happens. I mark it in green. It actually starts out, where is it? It's on this floor here, floor 13, column 79 is this one at the back, and Girder A2001 is just kind of behind this, going to the back wall. So if I play this, you will see nothing's really happened with column with that A2001. It's way back there. This girder has collapsed. This girder has collapsed. This girder has collapsed. This girder has collapsed. Girder's collapsed over here. Girder's collapsing over here. Some damage down here. These are all kind of starting to go. And if we continue to play, now we see that particular girder A2001 actually collapse at this point. So Girder A2001 isn't used in the global model in terms of an initiating event. It's just something that will fall, because all the girders fall at some point. But really what happened is the other girders around it failed first. This is, I don't know what this is, 2002 maybe. But there's 4 different girders here with fire damage, and they collapse. So this is NIST's global model. So if you want to compare your global model to NIST's global model, then you can't be talking about like, oh, well, A2001 couldn't possibly have collapsed, because it didn't in NIST's model, in NIST's A2001, NIST's global model, their LS-DYNA model, which did in fact have good connections, which I'll come to in a second. So there it is. And in a global context, you can see it's the same type of thing. Mark floor 13 in red here, and you will see there's all the other damage is not on floor 13 yet. It's around it over here, and it does eventually fall out. And again, this is what an actual dynamic model looks like, a nonlinear dynamic analysis, which is what you should do if you want to model a falling building. You don't just model one block rotating above another block. Okay, next question. What is the animation in figure 4.24 derived from? Because it looks like it was done by hand. Now, this is the one that's, obviously meant to match the famous videos. We see that the penthouse snaps in two and it falls into the building. And it stops right here for some reason. And then the rest of the building collapses. You will see this go down, and then the rest of the building collapses. So this is something that's obviously intended to match the actual collapse. And there's two versions of this, 4.24a, 4.24b, and you can see better, I think, what's going on in 4.24b, and this is kind of where we get to the problems with this. Notice the way the penthouse has collapsed here. I'm just going to pan back and forth a little bit here. It snaps in two in the middle, and then it very, very neatly pivots around what seems to be this point here and this point here. It's kind of like rotating. So this means the bottom corner here actually kind of lifts up. It's really kind of bizarre. And then when it gets to a certain amount of pivot, it all starts to fall simultaneously. And then it gets to about here, and then it starts to kind of close up on itself, and then it looks like it wraps around something and then stops. It's all very strange. I suppose it's supposed to be wrapping around the girders across the columns, but if they're all gone, what's it actually wrapping around? It doesn't make any sense. But anyway, the more of the point is that you have got this remarkably smooth rotation here with zero deformation. It's almost like they've split this into two halves. They've manually rotated each one out, and then they've manually made it fall down to here with nothing else going on. Nothing's really being damaged here. And then they manually made it stop here. And then after that, we got another strange thing, which is this just kind of neatly falls into the building, looking nothing like what actually happened, which there was loads of deformation going on in the real thing. Here's another comparison of the NIST model with this. And this is the real view taken from some distance away, so it's a little hard to see. But I'll just run through it real quick. We'll see the interior damage going on in the NIST model, which will eventually lead to collapse. See, nothing's happening here yet. Oh, so now we've got the falling in of the two penthouses, and you saw that in the middle one, and then everything collapses. So let's just look at that in a little bit more detail. Here we've got the tipping in of the penthouse. Now, notice again, we've got this kind of strange rotation, this strange outward rotation in the Hulsey model. In the NIST model, it kind of crumples inwards. So the tops of the building, the tops of this penthouse move inwards, the bottoms do not move. And this matches reasonably well what we actually see in the real world model. If you look at the real world model here, you'll see that it's tilting inwards, and it's crumpled very irregularly, like we have here. And in contrast, the Hulsey model, it's got this very strange regularity, and we've got this very strange outward tilting of the bottom of the model, like it's pivoting around the top rather than around the bottom, which you would expect. So it doesn't really seem to be based on an actual physical thing. It's almost as if they've taken some angles from their static analysis and then manually animated something to make it look like what's happening, but they kind of got it wrong in that they rotated the penthouse pieces around a different rotation point. Here it is, like in more detail. You can see what actually happens. So let's just play this. Okay, so notice that this is all crumpled in. It looks obviously not realistic because it's just a wireframe, but it's lots of distortion, which is what you will expect from these columns being removed. It's not going to neatly just crack in half and lower itself into the building, which is kind of what it does here in the Hulsey model. So let's focus on the Hulsey model for a second. I'm going to go back and forth there. You see this weird kind of just rotating and spreading outwards with no drop, and then all of a sudden it starts to just very neatly just fall into the building without moving at all. Whereas if you compare that to the NIST model, you see a lot more actual distortion, which I think much more closely matches the actual reality of the situation. You can see especially this side here tilting in, and this kind of irregular nature. And you can see this a bit more in the other videos. But this just seems kind of ridiculous. What is actually supposed to be going on here? And if I zip back here, there's another interesting thing we can look at real quick. hopefully you can make this out, but if you watch this, you'll see when the penthouse falls into the building, you can see the building windows all kind of ripple outwards as the penthouse falls in. And what you'll notice is that the rippling area, just move forward a little bit, it goes in. All right, so you can kind of see it's a bit brighter here. You'll see that move all the way down, whereas in Hulsey's model, the penthouse kind of stops here. So let me just play that. It's going down, 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 down. The brightness goes all the way down to here. I'm going to go back and forth a little bit here. You see it going all the way down. And this is something you can, there's threads on Metabunk that show this in a bit more detail. Okay, so why do you confuse NIST's ANSYS model with the LS-DYNA model? He makes a big deal of this, and he talks about it in the presentation, Professor Hulsey. And he says that he thinks that NIST had different stiffness on one side of the building or the other because of this here. But you know, as I noted before, and as actually it says in the model, it's the ANSYS model. It's a 16-story model. It's not the global model. You know, his objections here don't really make any sense, and it's a bit worrying because it kind of shows that he doesn't really understand the NIST model, and he's been ignoring all of the criticism of his report for like the last 2+ years. This is something that was pointed out, I believe, around 2 years ago, when he did his original presentation, when he concluded that fire could not have caused the collapse. He used this exact same thing and said that the NIST model used stiffness differently on one side than the other, when it was only the 16-story model, and only because they were only modeling the local connections around this area, because they wanted to see what would happen around these connections. It wasn't a global response model. So it's a bit worrying that he doesn't actually understand that. But, you know, really, I think the big issues here are, why do we have this ridiculous usage of static linear analysis for something that's obviously very dynamic and nonlinear? And why do you have these rather ridiculous things that are being passed off as being dynamic analysis when they're clearly nothing of the sort? Now, this is just my first pass at this, and I probably got some things wrong. There's probably some things I don't understand. Maybe there's reasons for this ridiculous animation. Maybe, I don't know, I can't think of any reasons, but there's some technical reasons why you couldn't actually show the LS-DYNA animation, no, the SAP 2000 animation. But there's no reason for that. SAP 2000, you've got buttons you can press and it will pop out in animation. Obviously, if you did a dynamic analysis, then you have the positions of all the members, and you could render out something which shows what happened to it. That's not what's going on here. This is just the top half rotating around the bottom half. And frankly, it looks quite ridiculous. Anyway, I anticipate making another video with corrections to this video. So if you think I got something wrong, please put it in detail in the comments below, or email me, mick@mickwest.com, or you can post on Metabunk. Thank you.